Welcome to Job Tales, the show where we find out about different professions from the people who know. Each week I speak to a new guest with an inspiring job. We talk to behavioral scientists, lawyers, sport artists, you name it. We hear about their personal path to doing what they do, the skills required, and the tools they use for the job. I'm Laura Leoncini, and today my guest is Jonathan Duff. Based in the UK, Jonathan has had several professional lives, from actor to teacher to street food entrepreneur. Definitely a person with lots of interests and who loves new challenges. Jonathan, thank you for being my guest today. Your job is so interesting. I'd like to know right away how you thought of getting into street food business.
First of all, thanks for having me. Delighted we finally found the time.
Yes.
I've had a lot of jobs, actually. I was an actor, and then I went into teaching for about 8 years. And then I got to the end of that period. I think I'm someone who gets bored quite quickly, and I need a lot of engagement with what I'm doing. I need to be learning all the time. I find it really important. I was sitting down with my father, and he was saying, he said to me, I'm quite impressed because you've always managed to do what you love for a living. How have you done that? And I said, well, I couldn't imagine doing anything that I didn't love for a living. And he said, well, what else do you love? You know, I loved acting. I loved teaching, but I also really enjoyed cooking. I wasn't a professional chef. I'm not a professional chef. I'd worked as a waiter and, as a kitchen porter, as lots of people do when they're acting. And I said, I love food. And he said, well, then you should look at that. So I just literally got on the internet and started looking at, I had no money, no savings. My wife had just quit a very, very lucrative job herself to become a Pilates instructor.
Okay.
So she was just starting off a new entrepreneurial business. And I could see that in the UK, and this is about 8 years ago now, the street food scene that had been very successful in the US was really only just starting to take hold in London and outside London. And where we live is near a city called Milton Keynes. And there's lots of offices, there's lots of things going on the weekends. And I thought, well, I'll try that. And I really just looked on the internet, found a truck that I liked the look of because I knew I wanted to do sort of American style street food. It's just food that I like, ribs and brisket. And I could see that the marketing potential for that was really, really strong. The branding could be really good. Drove down literally the next day, took out a very small loan that I couldn't really afford. Drove down, bought the truck, wrote the menu that night, got cooking the next day, and then 2 days later just got in my truck and started driving around to offices trying to sell. Just opening up, serving food, driving on again. I had no idea what I was doing, none. But I just knew the food was good, and I knew there was nothing quite like what we were doing where we were doing it. So I felt like there was a really good opportunity. And then it just grew and grew and grew from there until now we have 3 trucks, 2 cafes, and a restaurant, all under the same brand.
Okay, so 3 mobile solutions and the permanent ones. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay, 2 cafes. Wow. So, did you have to get permits in order to go around to offices and offer your food?
Absolutely.
Okay. So you did all that in. Yeah.
That was all in the first few days. Again, in the
Wow.
UK, it was very easy.
It's easy.
I just contacted the council that's in control of all of that. They were very helpful because there was no real animosity towards street food. The primary challenge was that you don't pay very much to run a street food truck in the UK. So the council isn't making a lot of money from you. So you have to be very careful about where you go and what you're allowed to do. There are things called allowed streets and non-allowed streets. Generally speaking, the non-allowed streets are where there are lots of large restaurants on the street that are paying a huge amount of rent and rates to the council, and they don't want you pitching up in front of there and taking away their business. So you do have to be quite clever about how you engage, but I just found that I didn't try and sneak around. I was just totally upfront, totally straightforward, and really let the beauty, if you like, of the truck and the food itself speak, so that very quickly it stopped being me having to find places to go and began being people trying to find out where I was to come and eat. And that was that was one of the 2 big changes that allowed us to succeed.
I see. Wow. So it's basically the way you're describing it, it sounds very easy. I bought a truck and then I got the license and then I went for it. So can it be as easy as that? Or because I can imagine people listening to today's episode and saying, okay, but I have, what kind of hesitations did you have back then, if you did have, and some that maybe today's listeners may have?
Yeah, I think I'm very fortunate. Maybe isn't the word, but I just have a very optimistic outlook. So I tend to
Okay,
assume things are going to work out anyway.
good.
I'm perhaps what I am doing. I would say is I'm making light of the extraordinary amount of work that I had to
Okay.
do in the scene behind the scenes. So from a top line point of view, what I'm saying is really true. I bought the truck, I designed the menu, I cooked the food, and then I went out and sold it. And because the permits aligned with the kind of food I wanted to do, it worked out quite well. But the truck broke down on it's a 1966 Mark I Ford Transit. It's a beautiful old truck.
Mhm.
And it allowed us to get into lots of very expensive locations because it is so beautiful as opposed to a kind of modern street food truck. However, I had to replace the engine within 2 weeks of buying it because I didn't really know how to run an old truck, and the engine overheated. And then I spent 2 months off the road trying to get a company to rebuild an engine for me because they no longer made that engine. I had to essentially take over the kitchen in our house, build a shed outside that was full of freezers and fridges. And my wife and I and my mother-in-law, who lives with us, were, you know, cooking tray after tray of chicken and beef brisket until 4 in the morning
Mhm.
to have enough food to go out the following day. So
Oh.
the challenges were making having a really clear sense, which I had ahead of time, what food I thought would sell well. And in that sense, I did a lot of market research. I looked into what other street food companies were in the area. I researched into what street food companies in London were doing particularly well, what was selling well. So I did my market research to find out, where the niche was, and then making sure that my pricing, my branding, my food styles spoke to a very specific demographic, and
Yeah.
that demographic had the extra money to spend on street food, because there's no point in selling a 15-pound burger if everybody else is used to spending £4 on a burger. You're not going to
Mm.
sell anything. So it was aligning those markets with what I was selling, and then just an astonishing amount of work, cooking, prepping, cleaning, fixing, and then on top of all of that, finding companies to go to, running the marketing campaigns for those companies. So yeah, I would say I was fortunate in a couple of areas, but ultimately it came down to belief in what I was doing, and then the willingness to put in initially sort of 70-hour weeks in order to get there.
70-hour weeks. Okay. And was that sustained over the course of the years that we have had the food
No,
truck?
no, that was so it was quite interesting. The turning point for the company was actually about 6 months in. We've been doing very well. We had some private events now, sort of weddings looking at us. We had parties. We had the public events like, you know,
Mm.
council fireworks parties and that sort of thing. And then there was a competition, and it was the second one of its kind, which was a food and beverage competition across the whole of Milton Keynes. So it was a big competition, and lots of hotels and restaurants and all sorts of things. But they added a new category in, which was street food, because there are about 7 or 8 of us now operating in and around the city and in and around the county.
Hmm.
And they were pretty good, and the quality was pretty good. So they included it, and we won. We won the competition.
Oh, fantastic.
It was an amazing thing to achieve, but being able to put that onto our marketing, being able to express that when we talk to companies and to individuals, allowed us to do two things. One, we suddenly started getting access to events that had the potential for much more revenue. Things like, instead of doing a local fireworks party, we're now being invited to the Blenheim Palace fireworks party, or Alexander Palace in London, or to the O2. So these are places where you're
Mm.
paying a lot more money to be there, but
Hmm.
instead of making £2,000 to £3,000 a night, you have the capacity to make 25 to £50,000
Yeah.
if you're doing really, really well. But what that
Incredible.
meant was, it was no longer viable for me to A, be doing it all by myself, and B, to be operating out of the kitchen. So I actually initially went looking for what we call in the industry a dark kitchen, and that's a kitchen that's not used all the time. Maybe it's in a pub that's only open 4 days a week, or maybe it's in a a really, what we actually found was a really nice kitchen in a community center that wasn't used at all. And we started doing our cooking there. That then led to looking at cafes, because really what I was looking for with a cafe was somewhere where we could do all our cooking, and the money that we made from the people coming into the cafe would essentially offset the cost of renting out, a kitchen. So it was
Okay.
really,
Ah,
there was nothing to do with wanting to
it was
be in what
in
we,
cafes. Yeah.
yeah, it was nothing to do with that. It was just trying to find a kitchen that would pay for itself.
Necessity. Okay, dark kitchen. It's interesting, the name, the choice of the
Yeah,
name.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's just because it means they're not on. And at that point, I had to hire more people. So I had to
Mm.
hire a chef. I had to hire front of house for the cafe, and those were the people who ended up being the staff for the truck as well. So I can't honestly say I had a plan in relation to that side of it, but it was just being very flexible and being very open to new ideas, and really just trying to maximize any of the new opportunities that came along. We in those first 2 years, I can't imagine that I said no to anything that people suggested. We would try it, and we would find out whether it was a takeaway service in the evenings, whether it was from the cafe, whether it was using the truck to go to sites for construction, and see if there were really large numbers of people who didn't have access to food. We even got into quite a lot of television work, doing the catering on site for
Catering.
films
Ah.
and TV shows. And I never really knew exactly, because I don't have a financial background at all. So apart from being able to do a very simple cost analysis, I never really knew before I did it whether these were going to be successful or not. But we try them, and if it worked, we do it again, and if it didn't work, we wouldn't.
Okay. What would be your capacity? I mean, up to how many meals can you prepare with a food truck?
Well, the largest booking we ever took on was for 1,000 people for a lunch, and and we
Wow.
had to serve 1,000 people in 2 hours, and we had two trucks, and we bought a tent, and we basically hired in an external kitchen that we built into the tent. And in that instance, yeah, it was what, 500 people an hour. It's sort
Wow.
of one
Massive.
person every 2 or 3 seconds we had to serve,
Oh my
which
God.
which we did. And I would say that actually one of the best things that I learned, which lots of street food traders use if they're good, is the idea of a queue management. And if you get into any kind of
Mm.
any kind of environment where you're selling in a public place, your most useful tool is queue management. So if you're walking around a street food market, if you're walking around a craft market, the Russians learned this long ago. Where there's a queue, people will join the queue. It's a really
Hmm.
weird human trait.
Very
So you won't
psychological.
go you won't go where it's quiet. You'll go where it's busy to find out why it's busy, because our brains assume that a social interaction is a good thing, and therefore it's more likely that it's going to give you pleasure from there being more people rather than fewer. It's just a kind of human basic psychological need. So what I would do is if we were a bit quiet, I would leave the team on the truck, and I would go stand outside and become the first person on the queue, looking at the menu. I'd pretend to be having a phone call with someone who was ordering and be like, "This looks amazing. Oh my God, that looks amazing." And then as people join behind me, I go, "Oh, I'm still choosing. You go first." So then they'd be the front of the queue. I then go to the back of the queue. And as more people came in, I would just go further and further back until the queue was long enough that I would jump back on the truck and start working again. And then equally, you would have the staff manage the speed. So if the queue is only 4 or 5 people, my staff, who I always made sure knew the food inside and out, they knew everything about it, they could recommend things, they'd have chats with the customers about, what's going to suit them best and how this sauce was made. So you slow the queue down. If there's now suddenly 7 or 8 people, you
Hmm.
just speed the queue up. And so everyone knows that the queue of around about 5 or 6 people is long enough that what you're selling is interesting, and
Yeah.
short enough that you're not gonna leave and go somewhere else. So queue management was crucial.
It was key. Wow. And did you change location every time,
Yeah,
or
absolutely. We
yeah?
never. I think a lot of street food traders who fail, you can buy a pitch or you can rent a pitch from the council, and that's where you're basically in one location on a street somewhere. You put a little sign up and you try and get people to come and eat with you. The problem with that is that you may be successful for a short period of time, but unless you're changing your menu dramatically, eventually the people around that area will get bored and go somewhere else. Whereas if you're mobile, the whole beautiful thing about being in a truck is that you
Hmm.
can go to where the people are.
Yeah.
So when we were busiest, which was just before COVID and then just after, we were doing about 180 events a year. So about one every other day. But usually they were when we had two trucks, they were really focused on the Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So we'd have six events
Mm.
on between two trucks over that weekend. And I would say pre-COVID that we were doing about 70% public events and about 30% private.
Yeah.
And post-COVID, we were doing about 80% private and about
Hmm.
20% public. The COVID
There's a
experience for
change.
catering completely shifted the way in which the industry works.
Okay. Was that a reason to? I mean, my question would be actually, have you continued with the street food business?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very
Okay.
successful. I mean, I've actually just, as I mentioned, started working with a company in the US that's nothing at all to do with catering. So
Right.
I've passed on the day-to-day running of the truck to another team that I decided to work with. But it's still
Okay.
my
So it's
company, and
okay.
I'm still kind of involved in day to day.
Okay, that's great. Now, because I can, of course, think of some young listeners that say, "Wow, a food truck," and the also the sense of freedom that you have, and you can do whatever you want. You also can keep it locally and contained, or major like you have done for events. So it's very appealing, and the question is, can you make your living off of it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
and again, it is a young person's game. So I decided to take it on. Well, I'll tell you what. I'll tell you a story. When we were about 2 years in, and I brought in someone to be my partner in the company, and he was the same age as me, which at the time was kind of mid-30s.
Okay.
We both had young children, and I said to him, Ed, I can either give you lots of money or lots of time, but this won't give you both. So what do you want? And we were like, well, we got young kids. We want lots of time. I was like, great. So we'll keep it small. We'll keep it local. We'll hire staff to run the truck, rather than serving ourselves. We'll make slightly less money, but we'll have time. And I did. So I had enough money to, ensure that we had a mortgage paid and food, but we weren't rolling in money. But I had an enormous amount of time. I could take my
Right.
kids to school, I could pick them up, I could spend whole days with them. If we wanted to take a month off to go to South Africa, which we did a couple of times, we could, and we could afford to. So it never
Amazing.
made an enormous amount of money, but it was always
You had the
a lifestyle
freedom.
business that gave me a lot of time.
Yeah.
The 2 years previous to that, when I've been really pushing, I've been incredibly busy, and I kept my cost down, so it was making quite a lot of money. I mean, we were turning over in the first 2 years probably around £80,000 a year, but with very low cost.
Hmm.
And then I think our biggest year was 2019 pre-COVID, where
Mm.
the company turned over £600,000.
My
So
goodness.
but we actually
It's
made less
amazing.
money because our costs were incredibly high then. We
Yeah.
had rent, we had staff, now we got VAT because we've gone over the tax threshold. So our costs
Hmm.
really shot up. And the biggest challenge, and it's one that we're still tackling with now, is moving from being a what we call a sole trader with your own company that you own, which is how we started, to being an SME, which is a small to medium business with all the costs that are associated. Because the challenge with any food business is that your margins are pretty low. If you're selling an item for, say, £7, your costs are going to be somewhere in the region of £1.50 to £2 for the food. And then you've got, even on a street food truck by itself, you've got a little bit to pay towards the truck and the upkeep, towards the gas, if you have any staff on the truck, and then so you're looking at kind of 15 to 20% profit in that
Hmm.
environment. That reduces right down to sort of 6 or 7%, net, if you start building into being an SME and having all of these associated costs.
You're right.
So you'll make less profit, but you'll have a better return. Whereas if you get big, you'll make more revenue but less net profit. So it's a
Mm.
really difficult balancing act, actually, very difficult.
No, it's very interesting, and Do you have any, you talked about a couple of lessons that you learned. Do you need to, make compromises for this line of work?
That's a really great question. Your hours are often antisocial in terms of friendship groups because while other people are off meeting their friends, you're at events because that's when everyone's socially getting together. That's the that's the
Yeah.
absolute trade-off. You working weekends, obviously, so you work an awful lot of weekends as well. I think time management becomes very, very challenging, and you have to be aware of that. It's very physically demanding. I mean, if you're running your own street food truck, there's literally an awful lot to carry and lift and clean and tidy. It sounds silly, but the gas
Hmm.
canisters on most street food trucks are sort of 30 to 40 kilos each. And you've got to lug those around and unpack all the food and you'll get burnt because you're cooking in a tiny little kitchen. You have to be very adept at staying cheerful in customers' faces, even if you're having a terrible day, because the worst possible thing you can do is let your customers know that it's not going as well as you'd hoped it would. So there's a lot of acting or a lot of customer service involved as well. So it takes. I certainly don't want to give the impression that it was easy. It's been successful, but it requires an awful lot of different skills to be successful, if
Right.
that makes sense, because you've got to be able to market, you've got to be able to sell, you've got to be able to operationally run the business, logistically run the business, financially run the business. I mean, like any business, if you're going to be an
Yeah.
entrepreneur and start it
Yeah, for
yourself,
sure. Hmm.
it's just that in street food, you've got the additional challenge of a lot of physical work and a lot of time. The other thing that is very challenging, particularly in the UK, is you're actually reliant on something that you have no control over a lot of the time, which is the weather.
Hmm.
So
True.
unless you get heavily into the private market, obviously where people are paying you in advance and it doesn't make any difference if it's raining at a wedding. Obviously it's bad for the bride and groom, but it makes no difference to you.
Yeah.
If your business is going to be focused on public events and, street side, in the UK, we have something like 160 days of rain out of 365 a year. And you can say with absolute certainty that those days, depending on how bad it is going to reduce your sales by 50, 60%.
Hmm.
Um, so you've got to get
That's a good
very, very
point.
good at optimizing the good weather, really good at
Wow.
optimizing when the good weather is going to be.
Yeah. So yeah, also compromising when you're gonna be working, and there's no like Monday to Friday kind of job
Nope.
or
Which is
or
great if you like that. I love that. I love the
yeah.
uncertainty of knowing. I love never knowing where I was going to be 2 weekends from then. I love turning up at new locations. I mean, I will say this: if you do well, you get to do some really cool things. I mean, I remember. I know you asked for a couple of anecdotes, and one of the ones I knew when I'd made it to the level that I wanted to be at was where, for a couple of years, we'd done this festival in the UK. It was the Reading Music Festival, and we'd paid quite a lot of money to be there. And we were just one of several hundred street food vendors around the huge area. But then we were good and we got noticed by the management. And on the third year, we got asked to be one of two caterers backstage catering to all the acts and the stars and the musicians.
That's
And
awesome.
I didn't really think much about it, but we were backstage setting up, and I left my team to just set the truck up. And I had this cool bracelet they'd given us all, which gave us kind of all access passes because we needed to get through different areas. And I walked onto the stage or kind of backstage as I think it was Smashing Pumpkins were getting ready to do their set. And I was
Okay.
stood just listening to do the sound check. And I looked out from their point of view, and there were sort of several thousand people. But then I could see all these street food trucks lining the edges. And I thought, a year ago, I was paying money to be there. And now I'm being paid up front to be here.
Amazing.
This is where I want to be. This is where and once you reach that level, then you think, okay, well that's where we are now, and that's where we have to stay. It
Yeah,
was
I
great,
see.
actually. It's a good gig.
Brilliant. And I have many more questions, but my last one will be about food. What suggestion you have? Because of course, food must be an important ingredient for the success of the business. What would you advise to some young people that want to take on a food truck?
That is a really great question because people do, generally speaking, do one of two things. Either they have a particular passion for a very specific type of food and they just do that all in. And that's fine. You can do well that way if that particular type of food is very popular. But I remember running into a guy at a couple of events, and he was brilliant. He had this beautiful little truck, and he was so passionate, and he was Italian, and he was making arancini.
Okay.
Which were phenomenal. I mean, they were some of the best arancini I'd ever eaten. But he was always quiet, because when people go to the kind of gigs he was booked for, they were looking for burgers and hot dogs and stuff to fill them up because they were drinking. They weren't really looking for arancini. So, one, he was either doing the wrong food, or two, he was in the wrong place. And in the end, he closed after about a year. Or people go the other way, which is also a danger, where you do the cheapest option you can. So you're like, well, I'm going to buy the cheapest burgers, I'm going to buy the cheapest buns, and I'm going to, it'll cost me 30 pence to buy it, and I'll sell it for a fiver, and I'll make money all day long. But that's not true either, unless you are on a construction site, or you've really chosen your location well, because people in the UK, and I think across the world, have a much greater and wider palate. They're much more excited about food than they used to. So what I would say is two things. One, choose food that you love, because if you love it and you eat a lot of it and you make it and you like it, chances are the people who buy it are going to like it too. Like, I never, ever worried about the quality of my food, because I thought it was delicious. And I was like, well, if I like it, and I'm quite picky, then other people are going to like it too. But I specifically chose a type of food. Bandit did things like, at the time it was very popular, slow roasted pulled pork. We did a firecracker beef brisket. We did a really lovely katsu chicken burger with an apple cider coleslaw and kimchi. And so what I did, and actually we had a very early review from a lady who turned out to be from BBC Good Foods, and she just found me at a market in my second week, and she wrote this lovely review, and I used the tagline. Two things. She said, "Find Jonathan, eat his chicken, and then eat, sleep, repeat," which I loved. But then she also said it was worldwide flavors with British behaviors. And what that meant was that I'd looked at all these different flavors that I'd loved, and then kind of put this slightly British twist, a sharpening up of those flavors into something that was very popular for British flavors. And that worked really, really well. So take what you love. If it's very unusual, have a little think about making it more mainstream. If it's very mainstream, have a little think about making it slightly more interesting and unusual. And in that sense, you'll land well. Oh, and always have a burger. Because some people just want a burger. It always annoyed me that, we spent hours marinating our chicken and cooking the beef brisket and doing this. And then eventually I just had to add a good burger, because there's a group of people who will come with their kids, usually older people, and like the kids will grab the katsu or the John Dillinger beef brisket, but then the dad or the granddad's like, I don't really like that kind of food. I just want a burger, and you're like, cool, I've got a great burger for you.
Excellent advice. Thank you, Jonathan. And thanks so much. It was very insightful, and I would love to talk about your present job. I will do it in another episode, because it's something completely else. So you're really full of great resources and surprises. Thanks a lot.
It's been a real pleasure. It's good to talk to you. And I'd be delighted to speak to you again. We'll just try and hopefully this time I can be better at finding the time. But thanks for persevering. It's been lovely.
That was Jonathan Duff, street food entrepreneur. If you'd like to listen to this episode again or more from the Job Tales series, go to worldradio.ch/jobtales or search Job Tales wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Laura Leoncini, and I'll be back next week for another episode of Job Tales with a brand new guest, the same time next week on WRS.